Hello again. In this video we're going to we're going to install a piston. I've already installed a couple of them, 1, 2, this is going to be number 3 going in. And first things first, take off the rod cap, and we're going to go ahead and install the bearings. Be a little careful when you think about when you're going to install your bearings. Much easier to install them before they go in the block, but it's not impossible to reach around the crank and install them. The only concern is if they go in tough and you have to tap them harder than you mean to, than you'd like to, then you might drop a bearing out on the floor. But that doesn't seem to be the case with this motor. They seem to be going in well. Also, while we're talking about it, let's talk about the connecting rods, connecting rod bearings particularly. These connecting rods do not have a notch for a tab that would be on the bearing. So these bearings are just smooth slick. That tab is only there for placement. It's not there for retention. Once you put this rod cap on with both bearings, they crush. And that crush keeps the rod bearing from turning in the rod. So it's not necessary for crush to have that tab. That tab is only a locating tab, and it centers the bearing in the rod end. In our case, these don't have that. So when you install them, just make sure they're roughly centered, and make sure they're installed as well as you reasonably can. I'm going to go ahead and put some assembly lube on this bearing, and we're going to drop this piston down in there. Let's talk about putting the piston in. There's an aftermarket tool to basically a set of runners that come out from the rod that place it around the end of the crank, keep you from impacting the crank with your rod. Another way to do that is just to simply have the crank at bottom dead center, away from the piston as far as possible. And then when you install it, don't install it beyond much beyond the top of the cylinder. So we want to lubricate the cylinder. I've got a little just clean, fresh motor oil right here. We're going to lubricate the cylinder. Also, we're going to lubricate the skirts on the piston. That's this part down here. So we lubricate the skirts on the piston. You can put some around the rings, however you want. It's just about ease of installation and to prevent scratching and things like that. Now, to actually let me stick this in here, get it out of the way before I mess up. This is the bearing for the rod cap. And again, we're going to center it up and simply press in place, and you're good. Doesn't take much, and we'll lubricate that later. We don't want to lubricate it right now because we're going to plastic gauge, and we don't want lubricant on the plastic gauge surface. We'll install that after we're done with the plastic gauging. So that rod end's ready to go. Now when you install this piston, like before we talked about, there's a forward mark, also forward on the side of the skirt. It shows you. One, I guess, tricky thing, I don't know, unless you have the best of ring compressors, it's very common in my experience to have the rings try to jump out and get stuck between the ring compression tool and the head of the deck of the block here. So what I do is I simply use one of our old pistons from a prior install, or from this prior life of this motor, and use that as basically like a driver, and it keeps the ring compressor from trying to go conical. Sometimes it'll try to fold in at the top as you drive the piston out the bottom, and then the ring can slip out the bottom. So I use an old piston in there. Now, this next thing is very much a feel thing. When I start tapping this piston down in here, I'm literally tapping it. I am not driving the piston into the cylinder. I'm just tapping it, and it's more or less going of its own recognizance. Just a light tap. Sounds a little loud, just because of the metal noise, but yeah, I was not pounding that piston. If you have to pound your piston to get it in there, then you probably have some other problem going on, a ring that's stuck against the deck or something like that. So don't do that. Just light taps. It should progress steadily as you tap it. So the piston's installed into the cylinder from the top side. Now we need to work it from the bottom side to get that rod end sorted out. And so we're going to roll the block 180 degrees. You may hear the rod end move. It's okay, just rotate it nice and slow. Yeah, like that. So just rotate it nice and slow so you don't have things banging around in there. So it's probably going to be hard for you to see. I'll push it upward a little bit. But the let's see if we can do this here. There we go. So we've got the piston coming up. Rod end is close to engaging. The crank, not quite. Okay, so the main thing you want to be real careful of is that you don't contact the bearing surface here on the crank hard and cause it to scratch the journal. So what I'll do is I'll get it close at hand there and put my hand on the rod. I will slowly rotate the crank and engage the rod onto the crank ever so kindly. Just like that. So now to get it where I can put the screw on it, that's another thing. It's engaged. Hold the rod end on. There we go. So we've got it where we can pretty much manage it. See if I can turn it just a little bit more this way. There we go. So the rod end is mated to the crank. I'm going to take a little of this oil that dripped on there off so that we can plastic gauge this thing. So now, like before as we did with the mains, we're going to plastic gauge these bearings. I've plastic gauged the two that were previously installed. Plastic gauge this one as well. Plastic gauge them all. Just so that you know that everything is right in your motor. You can certainly make a case for just saying, oh well, I checked it once, it's bound to be right every time. But this is your only chance to make sure. And there are certain things I guess I'm more neurotic about than others. My wife and children would certainly agree with that statement. But this one, bearing clearance is extremely critical to the successful operation of any motor. So we need to be sure that we get it right. So here's our plastic gauge. And we're going to seat the rod end cap. And we're going to run these 11mm bolts, I believe they are. We're going to run them down. Alright, now the torque procedure for these rods, these rod bolts, is 20 foot-pounds torque and 90 degrees. One key thing to remember is that these are torque to yield bolts, so you do not reuse torque to yield bolts between rebuilds. So be sure, as we did, that you get new ones. We only had to get 8 new rod bolts. 2 of our rods are brand new with brand new bolts, so that made that a bit easier. Okay, so here's our angle. We're going to come to right here, like that. And same on this, we're going to come to here. Okay. Yeah, motor rolls around a bit, but what are you going to do? So I like to give that a few seconds to conform. before I take it off. So let's do that. So we gave it a minute or two to conform, the plastic gauge to conform to the space. Now we're going to remove that rod end cap. And we're going to see what we have. Hopefully you can see that. It's very hard to tell the glare and whatnot, but basically if I take this plastic gauge, we're somewhere between 10 10,000ths and 15 10,000ths. The top spec on this motor is, I believe it's 12 or 13 10,000ths. So we're very much in the range of what we should be, and so we're happy. They've been consistently between 10 and 15 10,000ths, most of the time closer to 10 10,000ths, and so we've been pretty happy so far. We are at the top end of the allowance, but these are just stock parts on the reinstall, so they should be quite right. So let's go ahead and you basically just go through the same torque procedure again, which is 20 foot-pounds followed by 90 degrees. I always like to check my torques twice just to make sure that things don't reseat and change the torque allowance, or change the actual torque of the bolt. So here we go again, 90 degrees. See if we can wrestle this engine stand. All right. So that rod is installed. Well, I guess I can reveal my mistake. Maybe you noticed it. Don't know. I certainly didn't notice it, but when I put this rod cap back on after I plastic gauged the clearances on that bearing, I put it on backwards, and not a problem necessarily, because I checked rotation. And when I checked rotation, I found out it wouldn't rotate. So that told me something was wrong. I looked at it and realized that I had put it on backwards. So always rotate the motor after installation of anything on the drive line, and you'll catch some things, I promise. One thing I like to do, just as a reference for you, you might notice some white dots on these bolts. Whenever I complete the torque on a bolt that requires torque, then I usually put a small white dot on it, just so I know when I'm done. I go back, I look, everything's torqued. There's no uncertainty there. So the next thing you want to do is, before you flip the block back over, is you want to align your next rod journal at bottom dead center, as far away from the piston as you can get, and then you're prepared to flip the motor and repeat the procedure. There's not much to putting them in. Do it 6 times and you should be done if you do it right. And what I always do is bring the block back up, so my next cylinder is at 90 degrees, and that gives me the surety that at 90 degrees my rod's going to go straight down in the block. It's not going to want to flop against the wall unless I become sloppy about it. And so now number 4 is ready to be installed, and just keep working our way back till we're done. Alright, well, we're going to cover the installation now of the windage tray, the oil pickup tube, and a temporary install, at least, on the oil pump. Oil pump right here on the front of the crank. There's a couple of flats here on the crank. I've already slid it on, and literally it just slides on. We're not going to fully secure the oil pump yet, because we also need to get the tensioner system installed before we can do that completely. There is a new O-ring fresh O-ring here in the suction side of the oil pump. So to begin, we're going to install the windage tray, and literally the windage tray just sits on there. The one thing you want to do when you install this windage tray is you want to put a few oil pump bolts through the gasket area into the block. If you don't, you could potentially have your oil pan gasket askew whenever you try to put your oil pan on. And so we put a few of them here. I put about 4 or 5 of them, whatever, 4 or 6, something like that. And the intent there is not to, just to hold it from shifting when you tighten these nuts here on the windage tray and the oil pickup tube. So now we know that we take these bolts back off when we're done, that the windage tray will be in the right place. The other thing that goes on at the same time as the windage tray is the oil pickup tube. I want to be sure and oil this area a little bit. There's a fresh O-ring right here. We don't want to tear that O-ring. So I'm going to use a little fresh engine oil on the O-ring just to make sure. And then we're going to put a little bit here around the nozzle that's going to go into the oil pump. So we'll go ahead and stick this down in here. Now the oil pump right now will move around a bit, so we can move things as we need to in order to get this thing on there, in there. Well, another option, by the way, is, I think I'll do it just to show you, is just go ahead and put this O-ring on here. You can move the oil pickup tube through the oil ring with it installed in the pump. That's fine too, but this works well also. So we've got 3 bolts, well, 3 fasteners. There's 2 nuts that hold this end of the oil pickup tube on, and then we've got this fastener bolt that holds the pickup tube to the oil pump. So we'll go ahead and fasten those up. I believe those are all number 13s, and they also all get 20 foot-pounds of torque according to the book. 250 inch-pounds, actually a little more than 20 foot-pounds, but it's not enough to worry about. 240 foot-pounds would be 20 inch-pounds. So we'll go ahead and get our torque wrench, short extension, just to make life a little easier, and we'll begin tightening and torquing these fasteners. So this should pretty much finish up the bottom end of the motor, with the exception of putting the oil pan on. We're not going to put the oil pan on yet. I'm going to wait and do some of the work on the top end, the timing system, and all those goodies. And then whenever you get the heads on, the timing system installed, then I'm going to turn the motor back up in upside down like this, and I'm going to fill the pickup tube with oil. I'm going to turn the oil pump just to try to prime things up, put an oil filter on it, just to try to prime things up, and then once we get that done, we'll put the oil pan on, and as soon as we flip it back upright, then we'll put oil in it for real, for keepers, and that way we'll retain our prime, hopefully retain our prime on the oil pump. So for now at least, we can pretty much call the bottom end done. And once this is complete, and again, like I said, the oil pump is actually just floating in place, but we'll finish it up whenever we put the tensioner system on. This tray. Yes, ma'am.
Hey, this is Dee, Cylinder Head Shop.
Yes.
Okay, you are ready.
Sweet. How much do I owe you?
$380.
$380. We'll see.
Yeah, it's $190 each.
Awesome. Awesome. I might not be able to make it today. I might have to make it in the morning. Let me see. I'll try though.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
All right, ma'am. Bye-bye. Well, that's good timing. All the bolts are now torqued and tightened, ready to go. And that phone call, which you may have heard, was from the head shop, the cylinder head shop, and our cylinder heads are ready. So now that the bottom end is done, the next thing to do is put on the heads. So we'll run grab those heads and keep moving forward. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.